Good afternoon. First of all, have to apologize for not being with you now. I would have loved coming to Leuven, but it was not possible, so now we have to make the best of it. Let's start. For many years, Vatican II was declared irrelevant, or at least insufficient, by two distinct sides of the theological spectrum. For liberals, it was too Catholic to be modern, and for traditionalists, too modern to be Catholic, to reference Massimo Fagioli's wonderful phrase. Today, Vatican II is also claimed to be irrelevant, or at least insufficient, from two distinct sides of the pastoral spectrum. It seems to be too secular to be relevant for highly religious people, and too religious to be relevant for religiously indifferent people. The latter one is the topic of my contribution: the possible irrelevance of Vatican II caused by religious indifference within the multiple modernities of our complicated and at the same time multi-religious and multi-secular world. There is an increasing number of people who define themselves neither as religious nor as atheist, but as indifferent. They just don't care, neither for the religious nor for the secular. They live in an indifferent, everyday secularity. To evaluate this major sign of our times theologically, I invite you to follow me in 3 steps. Firstly, I will take a closer look at this sign of our times, based on an international meta-study and on the Holy Scripture. Secondly, I will discuss the relevance of the Council along with Gaudium et Spes and 2 of the most important theologians of Vatican II. And thirdly, I will explore 3 dimensions of a future ecumenism of the Christian faith in the light of the Gospel among Christians, religious believers, and non-believers. First, indifference as a sign of our times. Please accompany me to Eastern Germany, a place which is supposed to be one of the most secular regions in Europe. Come with me to Leipzig main station. Some years ago, a group of students conducted a survey among the young people hanging around the station. The students asked whether they were Christians or atheists. And one of the answers became one of the most prominent empirical voices in German-speaking theology. I'm neither Christian nor atheist. I'm just normal. Weder noch, normal halt. Just normal. That means not Christian and also not atheist. This double negation mirrors a brilliant theological Denkfigur of Michel de Certeau, the neither nor. The Leipzig youngsters neither put the religious and the anti-religious into a modern either this or that opposition, either religious or anti-religious, nor they put it into a postmodern this and as well that relativism, religious and as well anti-religious, but rather into a late modern neither this nor that openness, neither religious nor anti-religious. This transcends classical complementary binarities of religion towards a third term, quotation genu, Certeau. Caroline Peters defines the secular lifestyle of these religiously indifferent persons very accurate. I have so little interest in religion that I would not even call myself an atheist. So let's have a sociological look at it. There is a fascinating inversion of the modern constellation of the religious and the secular. In classic modernity, religion was pushed out of the public sphere into the private. Today, the private is becoming more and more secular. See the following data. While, at least since 9/11, the public is more and more dominated by powerful religious narratives. Let's have a closer look at it. I just pick one significant meta-study showing the global decline of explicit religion based on empirical data from different world religions. The book Religion in Modernity and International Comparison, published in German in 2015 and in English in 2017. This international meta-study was conducted by my colleague Detlef Pollack in Münster and Gergely Roster. In favor of time, I have to skip now a little of my manuscript and immediately refer to their interpretation of the empirical data. They call the attitude of religious indifferent persons a pragmatic disinterest caused by, I quote, a shift of attentiveness in the practices of everyday life. The reason why people do not participate more in church life is not because they reject or criticize it, they write. Rather, church involvement is not that important to them. In the time of the church service, there are things to do that matter more for them. Sleeping in, reading the newspaper, visiting friends, going on a trip with the family, doing some work that has been left behind. End of quotation. This data-based interpretation describes the religious attitude of many normal Christians today. Theologically, one can judge this as a terrifying decline of Christian faith, like the conservative pessimist Edmund Burke did it. I quote, "Nothing is as fatal to the religious as indifference." But one can also appreciate it, like my Protestant colleague Christian Fechtner in his recently published book entitled Mild religiös, mildly religious. He evaluates contemporary forms of moderate Christian faith with great sympathy, and even welcomes the indifference of people we could call secular Christians, in analogy to secular Jews and secular Muslims. Being mildly religious means a from time to time switch from the secular life to religious practices, like lighting a candle, going on a pilgrimage, or singing in a choir. Let's have a closer theological look at it. Theologically, the relation between the religious and the secular is not symmetrical. The secular is not simply the opposite of the religious. It is the very basis of everyday life and, therefore, also of religious practices. Life is sometimes interrupted by extraordinary existential experiences that might be interpreted religiously as revealing ruptures. That's why theologically the issue of my topic is not only about relevance, but also about relevance, about revelation. Revelation interrupts the continuum of everyday life, and religious practices are reminding of this. It takes place in a literal sense. There is no separating extrinsicism between revelation and the secular, but there is a paradox immersion. Like Dietrich Bonhoeffer put it, God is beyond, in the midst of our lives. There is an incarnational in-logic of the other, which is crucial for my topic. Transcendence takes place in immanence, the supranatural in the natural, and revelation in the secular. Normally, in the practices of everyday life, the secular doesn't need to be related to the religious. Even explicit Christians are implicit secularists most of the time. They're everyday seculars who cook like others, ride bikes like others, and meet in restaurants like others. They live what Bonhoeffer called a secular life, etsi Deus non daretur, as if God did not exist. I quote, "Before God and with God, we live without God." They live without God, or at least without religion, which is a theological difference, and they don't seem to miss anything. They simply have other priorities in life than Sunday service, parish councils, or missionary events. What a happy coincidence! Jesus also had other priorities in life than explicit requirements of religion. The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. Following Jesus, a well-understood Christian secularism could refer to theological concepts like the non-religious Christendom of Dietrich Bonhoeffer, or to other great Protestant theologians like Friedrich Gogarten or Paul Tillich. But we can also refer to a major Roman Catholic source, Vatican II. The Pastoral Constitution Gaudium et Spes is a prophetic document for indifferent times because it behaves rather indifferent towards explicit forms of religiosity. It rather concerns the signs of the times, joys and hopes, griefs and anxieties of all human persons today are loci or topoi for doing theology on the doctrinal basis of Vatican II. Commonplaces in the best sense of the term, shared problems to which all people, religious believers and secular non-believers, can refer to in the global public discourse. This holistic approach of Gaudium et Spes includes what Gustave Thies here in Leuven called a theology of terrestrial realities. I quote Gaudium et Spes 36, just autonomy of the secular is an eminent locus theologicus of Vatican II. Marie-Dominique Chenu developed an entire theory of modernity on it. The Council followed this theological line. I quote, the first approach, and you can read it here. I just leave you some time to read. And the next part of my contribution I will skip in favor of time. I'm sure that you're familiar enough with the documents of Vatican II. So I come to my next point immediately. Karl Rahner and Marie-Dominique Chenu. This holistic approach of Vatican II appreciates not only the religious, which is no surprise for a Roman Catholic Council, but also the secular, which is a surprise. Theologically, this fact can be discussed at least in two ways. Both are linked with different theories of religion. One is a more German way. It starts with Niklas Luhmann and is based on the distinction of the immanent and the transcendent. The second is a more French way. It starts with Emile Durkheim and is based on the distinction of the sacred and the profane. The first approach can be thought anew theologically with the German Jesuit Karl Rahner, who stands for the immanence of transcendence, while the second one can be re-examined with the French Dominican Marie-Dominique Chenu, who stands for the holiness of the profane, of transcendence. Both Rahner and Chenu, and the second, are possibly the most important theologians of Vatican II. They are not only modern church fathers, but also open to a late or postmodern reprise of their approaches at the level of recent discourse. Let's have a closer look. Karl Rahner. Of transcendence. Karl Rahner was convinced that any God discourse must start with what we know best, our human existence, as the secular starting point for a theology of transcendent immanence. His anthropological turn of theology is based on the difference between the immanent and the transcendent. In every human life there is a hidden existential that causes a fundamental immanent desire for the transcendent. This Rahnerian theory of human self-transcendence, or as Gaudium et Spes 76 says, the transcendent character of the human person, became doctrine of the Church. Today, this must be developed further, from the transcendence of immanence to the immanence of transcendence. Judith Gruber speaks of a secular, I quote, trans-immanence of God. This is not so much about anonymous Christians not by name, but more radically about an anonymous God, a God without name. Religious people cannot claim any ownership regarding God's transcendent mystery at the very heart of secular immanence. According to Rahner, I quote, the secular world, too, is included into the salvific will of God and imbued by his grace. Now let's have a closer look at Marie-Dominique Chenu, transcendence, one of the theological main inspirers of Gaudium et Spes. He's more related to the French discourse on religion based on the difference of the sacred and the profane. Chenu too leads to a theological transgression of religious binaries. According to Christian faith, The holy includes and transforms both the sacred and the profane, because the holy and the sacred are not the same. Therefore, there's not only a sacred holiness connected with the religious, but also a profane holiness connected with the secular. In one of his influential talks during the council, Chenu emphasized this non-sacral holiness of the profane. I quote, "The sacred appears in all its uniqueness when it's compared with holiness. When the profane comes to the side of the sacred, it ceases to be profane. But the profane, which becomes holy, remains profane." One of the deepest characteristics of the Council is a great awareness of the intrinsic value of profane realities. End of quotation. Chenu was not only the spiritual master of the French worker priests before Vatican II, forbidden because of their desacralization of priesthood, but he also became the grandfather of liberation theology after the Council, forbidden because of its secular horizontalism. And he was glad that many Christians now left the sacred ghetto of the Church. I quote, "May the Christians perceive God's signs of the times, which he inscribes in profane reality. They will experience the happy surprise that grace can be found at work among non-Christians. Because the relevance of the gospel proves itself in the problems of people." Let me conclude. Welcoming the autonomy of the secular, both Rana and Chenu go beyond religious dichotomies, to the infinite mystery of everyday life beyond the difference of the immanent and the transcendent, and to the salvific holy of social practices beyond the difference of the sacred and the profane. After the Council, the secular theological Gretchenfrage, how are you with non-religion, caused the post-Vatican II opposition between communio theology, à la Lubac, Balthasar, Danielou, and Ratzinger, and a concilium theology à la Chenu, Rana, Congar, and Skilobeeks. The first were mainly Jesuit spiritual patrists, inspired by the world pessimism of the dualistic soteriology of St. Augustine. The second mainly Dominican contextual Thomists, inspired by the world openness of holistic incarnationism of St. Thomas Aquinas. The first ones voted for a fundamental supremacy of the religious, and the second ones for a fundamental respect for the secular. In my last step, focused on the future of Christian faith, I will follow the second line now. So I come to my end. First, a threefold ecumenism. The first phase of ecumenism after Vatican II focused on the intra-religious dialogue between Christians. This already had begun before the Council. A second phase focused on the inter-religious dialogue between religious believers after the Assisi prayer 1968-86. And then a third phase on the extra-religious dialogue with non-religious persons after the Assisi prayer 2011, to which agnostics like Julia Kristeva were invited also. So we have a first ecumenism, intra-religious, a second one inter-religious, and a third one extra-religious, with non-believers or religious indifferent persons. This last and third ecumenism among all people of goodwill integrates, permeates, and transcends the second ecumenism among religious believers as well as the first among Christians. Pope Francis, Fratelli e sorelle tutti. All share the same world. Ecumenism in its initial etymological sense means the common home, the oikumene of all. Vatican II was an ecumenical council precisely in this sense. A threefold ecumenism can be found in both of its constitutions on the Church, in Lumen Gentium, the dogmatic one, number 16, as well as in Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral one in 92. Because of the shortness of time, I will have to skip now the following passages. You will have to trust me to be right in this point. My last step. We need a new Christian existentialism. Christoph Theobald calls it faith in life, Lebensglaube. This existentialism explores the immanent and profane meaning of the gospel, as well as finding new secular allies for the kingdom of God. Therefore, we need not only a theology of the secular, but a secular theology. For some theologians, this might be a contradiction within itself. For others, it is the only way to be honest to God. The step from a distant genitive term, theology of the secular, to an involved adjective phrase, secular theology, makes it possible to invert Carl Schmitt's political theology, searching not only for, I quote, secularized theological concepts, but also for theologicizable secular concepts. Some, like Johann Baptist Metz, called it new political theology. More recently, others call it public theology or radical theology. Just see the wonderful volume, Secular Theology, American Radical Theological Thought from 2005. This brings me to the end of my contribution and to John Jack Caputo. He radicalizes the concept of radical theology by combining it with French theory, especially with Jacques Derrida. A fascinating theological move of extreme intellectual sexiness. In his wonderful new book, What to Believe, Caputo sketches a, I quote, theology for people who do not believe in God, for nuns and other seekers. This approach rethinks theology in dialogue with religious indifferent people, and it responds to the urgent need for what Lieven Bouwe called a recontextualization of faith. This, I quote Pollack and Roster, embedding enculturation encourages a re-embedding of theology in the field of the secular. To be existentially relevant, Vatican II-inspired theologies today must explore our societies with, I quote Chenu, saint curiosity. They will find, again Chenu, loci theologici in actu, like pop songs, football cultures, Netflix series, relevant for theology without being turned into a sort of quasi-religion. No invisible or implicit religion needed. And the good news is, Christian faith needs no religion either. Not necessarily, not everywhere and always, and not in explicit and visible forms. Religion is only a secondary, I quote Chenu, necessity of incarnation. The central message of the gospel, witnessed in the deeds and words of Jesus, is the beginning of the kingdom of God. And this includes secular experiences of liberation. The blind see, the lame walk, the lepers are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is proclaimed to the poor. Religiously indifferent secular lifestyles can help us to readjust our priorities in theology. Kingdom first. Joseph Ratzinger criticized this and other kingdom-centered approaches like the Latin American liberation theology as, I quote, regnocentrism. Ratzinger was convinced that such a focus on the social dynamics of the reign of God would directly lead to a fatal self-secularization of Christian faith. The French worker priests before Vatican II were less pessimistic. They called it a, I quote, complicity of shared hopes. Thanks for your attention.